I'd like to call your attention this morning to John chapter 6. The Gospel of John chapter 6. Now last week, right before I gave you the benediction, I really gave the introduction to this sermon, and I gave you the introduction to this whole series that I'm beginning today. The book of John is probably my favorite gospel, because what John does is John takes a very methodical approach to writing the story of Jesus. In fact, John tells us why he's writing his gospel. He tells us at the end of the gospel, he basically says, and I'm paraphrasing, if I had written down everything Jesus has done, then it would take all the books in the world to fill it. But what I have written that you might have life in his name, and that in having life, that you might believe in his name, and believing in his name, you might have life. John 20, 30, and 31. So John is writing a book to help us come to believe that Jesus Christ is God. And John in his gospel gives 7 miracles. 7 miracles that tell us and help us to see that Jesus is indeed God. For example, in John chapter 2, Jesus changes the water into wine. Everybody was amazed. When you read John chapter 2, you walk away saying, wow, Jesus is the Son of God. Then we read about how Jesus heals a nobleman's son. And we walk away saying, wow, Jesus is the Son of God. And we read that Jesus fed the multitude with just a tiny little bit of food. And we walk away saying, wow, Jesus is the Son of God. So John writes that we may believe, but also, once we believe, we might have life. And that we might have abundant life. That's what the Gospel of John is about, how we can come to know Jesus, and once we do, how we can find in him all the ingredients of eternal life. In John's Gospel, not only do we find 7 miracles, we find 7 statements by Jesus. And each statement tells us something about him that will help us live life to the fullest. In John chapter 6, we find the first statement. So let's read verses 32 through 35, and then we'll read verses 48 through 51. So they said to him, I'm in verse 30. So they said to him, what sign are you going to give us then, so that we may see it and believe you? What work are you performing? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written. He gave them bread from heaven to eat. And Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives the true bread from heaven. Now verse 48. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever. And the bread that I give for the life of the world is my flesh. What an amazing statement here Jesus is making. Jesus says to the folks, I am the bread of life. What did he mean by that? Well, when we put ourselves in the shoes of the person that's hearing Jesus say that, or to the person who John is writing to in the first century, and they hear Jesus say, I am the bread of life, all of a sudden their mind is going back to Exodus chapter 3. Their mind is going back to the moment that God calls Moses. Because when God introduced himself to Moses, he didn't shake his hand, he shook him up. He spoke to him from a burning bush. And God says in Exodus chapter 3, verse 6 to Moses, I am the God, your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And God said to Moses that I want you to lead the children of Israel out of bondage. I want you to lead them to the promised land. Well, Moses hears this, and Moses is kind of wondering what he's going to do with this call. He knows God is for real. He sees him from the midst of the burning bush. And God tells him, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. But Moses, well, he's a little bit reluctant. He says, okay, God, if you want me to lead these people out of Egypt to the land of milk and honey flowing, if I am going to be the one to do this, who shall I say sent me? And God says to Moses, I am. I am who I am. And he said, you will tell the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. What is God saying? I am the God that was. I am the God that is. I am the God that will be. That's who's sending you. God is saying, Moses, I am whatever you need me to be. Moses, whatever trouble you're facing, I am. When you need hope, I am. When you need peace, I am. When you need strength, I am. When you need courage, I am. Whatever you need in your journey, Moses, I am. And Moses would see it. Moses would understand that God was. Because when he needed to cross through the Red Sea, I am. God was the bridge. When he needed bread from heaven, I am. God sent it. When no matter what he needed, God was. Now, when Jesus says to the people, I am the bread of life, their minds go back to that episode. Their minds go back to when God was talking to Moses at the burning bush. And these people are thinking, whoa. In their minds, they're saying, this fellow just claimed that he was God. This fellow just claimed that he was the God who sent Moses. I am the bread of life. So Jesus is telling people that he's God and that he is the bread of life. So the bread of life, I am God and I am the bread of life. What does he mean? He means three things. He means that as the bread of life, Jesus, God, will do three things for us. First of all, Jesus saves us. When he said, I am the bread of life, whom had he been talking about? He'd been talking about Moses. Jesus said, Moses gave you manna. But it really wasn't Moses. It was my Father in heaven. My Father in heaven is really the one who gave you the manna. And keep in mind that on the previous day, Jesus had fed 5,000 with 5 barley loaves of bread and 2 small fish. They even had 12 baskets of leftovers. They had bread in their stomach, and now Jesus is talking to them, and they've got bread on their mind. And Jesus mentions that Moses told them that they would receive manna in the wilderness. It was a familiar story to all the people that Jesus was talking to. In Exodus chapter 16, we see the event. The children of Israel had been gone from Egypt about a month, and they're already complaining. They're already talking about how Moses and Aaron are lousy leaders. And they're beginning to say, Moses, we're hungry. Moses, we're thirsty. Moses, why didn't we stay in Egypt? If we'd only stayed back there in Egypt, we could have been fine. We had plenty to eat. Now you brought us out here to this wilderness, and we're going to die. So what happens? God says, Moses, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. And the people will go out and gather a certain quota every day. And that night, the dew came, and when the dew lifted, on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance. It looked almost like frost, many scholars would say. And when the children of Israel saw it, they said to each other, "What is it?" Because they didn't know what it was. And Moses said to them, "This is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." Anybody know what the word manna actually means? The word manna actually means, what is it? Because when the children of Israel went out and looked on the ground, they had never, ever came across anything that looked and tasted like this. So when they would talk, they would be, "Did you go get that? What is it this morning?" And it came from that, the word manna. And the manna was so good at first. Oh, it says in verse 31 of Exodus chapter 16 that the manna was white and it had the taste of wafers made with honey. It was really good the first day. Now here's the problem. The children of Israel ate that stuff for 40 years. And I have a feeling anything would get old after eating it for 40 years. The children of Israel, I'm going to say this while I can. The children of Israel ate manna longer than I've been alive. And by the end of those 40 years, I have a feeling somebody had even put together a cookbook. 101 ways to cook manna. They had boiled manna. They had broiled manna. They had baked manna. They had banana bread. They had hot manna and cold manna and cooked manna and raw manna. You name it, they tried it. Their manna was a desert food. And as long as they were in the desert, God supplied it. And they ate the manna every day until they crossed the border. The manna was divine food. For God was raining bread from heaven. The manna was daily. God selected it. He said, "This is the bread the Lord gave you to eat." And God sent just enough each day to meet their need. Nothing more, nothing less. He wanted them to learn that they could trust Him every day. He wanted them to learn that they could depend on Him every day. And one day at a time. You say, "Well, what was this manna really?" Well, it was Wonder Bread. It really was. It was Wonder Bread because it was God's provision for them. And here's what Jesus said about all of that. He said, "Moses really didn't give you that bread from heaven. My Father's the one who gives the bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the one who comes down from heaven and gives His life for this world." And then Jesus says to the folks, "I am the bread of life." Your fathers, well, they ate in the wilderness. They ate that manna. They ate it for 40 years. And guess what happened? One day they died. But if you'll come to me, the bread of life, I am God, the bread of life, the bread that came down from heaven, you'll never, ever die. What manna was to the children of Israel, Jesus Christ can be to you. Without the daily supply of manna, the children of Israel would have died. Without Jesus in your life every day, you will perish. It was the daily manna that kept them alive. It saved them. If they had no manna, they had no life. And if you're here without Jesus Christ in your heart today, you don't have life either. Jesus tells us, "I am the living bread, which came down from heaven, and the one that eats it will never die." So what does this mean when Jesus says, "I am the bread of life"? It means that He saves us. He saves us. He saves us from sin, and he saves us from the power of sin. Jesus would say in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness." Why? Because they'll be filled. I am the bread of life. And he who comes to me will never be hungry. And he who believes in me will never thirst. So as the bread of life, Jesus saves us. Secondly, as the bread of life, Jesus satisfies us. Verse 35. He who comes to me will never be hungry, and he who believes in me will never thirst. Now, there are some things that I can eat. I have tried my best to get on a diet where I can find something that I can eat and I'll just be satisfied and I'll just get even skinnier than I already am. But it just really doesn't seem to work very good. I love fruit, I love grapes, but I can go eat a pound of grapes and I'm not satisfied. I like Chinese food, but once I've eaten Chinese food, an hour later, I've got to have something else. It's just like it never satisfies. And the same's true for us spiritually. We try satisfying our deepest needs with things that just never really fully satisfy us, or they only satisfy us temporarily. Listen to how the prophet Isaiah described it. Isaiah 29 verse 8. It shall even be as when a hungry man dreams, and look, he eats. But when he awakes, and his soul is still empty. Or as when a thirsty man dreams, and look, he drinks. But he awakes, and indeed he is faint, and his soul still craves. Isaiah saying, here's a man who is only satisfied in his dreams. He dreams of having a satisfied soul, but he wakes and he discovers that he still has this craving. And there are so many who really want to be satisfied. They want to have a spiritual satisfaction. They want to have a physical satisfaction. And they're looking all over the world for the thing that will satisfy their soul. And Isaiah would say in chapter 55, he would say you spend money on what is not bread, and you spend your wages on what doesn't satisfy. And I'm afraid many of us have done the same thing. We keep on searching for the very things that will not satisfy. And we spend a fortune trying to find what will satisfy us when Jesus says, I'm the one that will satisfy you. I'm the bread of life. I'm the one who will come into your life and give you the nourishment and give you the satisfaction. That's me. Psalm 107:9 says that the bread of life will satisfy the longing soul, and it will fill the hungry soul with goodness. I ask you, is your soul satisfied? Because what Jesus does as the bread of life, he says, the one who comes to me will never be hungry. And the one who believes in me will never thirst. I think about those people, those thousands of people that Moses was leading in the wilderness. And for 40 years, God saw to it every day that the hungry were full. And that they never went to bed hungry. We read in the 78th Psalm that God commands the clouds above. And God opens the doors of heaven and had rained down manna on them to eat. And he gave them of the bread of heaven. Men ate angels' food. And he sent them food to the full, it says. They ate and they were well filled. Nehemiah talked about it. Nehemiah 9:15. He says, God, you gave them bread from heaven for their hunger. It's amazing to think that hunger is a gift from God, but it is. Because he causes us to be hungry that he might fill us. If you never grew hungry, you would never realize what it was to truly be satisfied and truly be filled. So as the bread of life, he saves us. As the bread of life, he satisfies us. And as the bread of life, finally, he strengthens us. The bread from heaven supplied salvation because Jesus is the saving bread. They would have perished without it, just like we'll perish without Jesus. It also supplied satisfaction. He satisfies the hungry soul. But the manna also supplied them with strength. And Jesus is also that strengthening bread. We read in the 27th Psalm that Jesus strengthens our heart. Now the people of Israel, they were in the desert and they needed strength to just put one foot in front of the other. They needed strength to wander around in this desert every day. And what happened? God sent them the exact thing they needed. No matter what their circumstances, God would send them what they needed. No matter what they faced, God would send them the answer. And Jesus says, I am the bread of life. And he's saying, don't you worry. Don't you worry when you say, I don't think I can face another day. He will give you the strength. Don't you worry when you say, I wonder how I'm going to do this. He will give you the strength. Don't you worry when it looks like you're facing something that will never, ever work out. He will give you the strength. You know, David shouldn't have been able to beat Goliath. Goliath was a whole lot bigger than David. Goliath was a whole lot taller than David. Goliath was a whole lot stronger than David. But David said, I'm coming to you in the name of the Lord. And when David came in the name of the Lord, he was stronger than anything the giant ever could throw at him. And Jesus says, I am the bread of life. I will save you. I will satisfy you. And I will strengthen you every day. And the people, they hear Jesus say, I'm the bread of life, and they're scratching their head, and they're saying, hold on a minute. This fella just claimed he was God. This fella's just saying he's the one who sent Moses. This fella is just saying that he'll be what we need. And you know what will happen if you'll try it out? He'll prove that he's right. And he'll prove that he is the bread of life. And that he can save you. And that he can strengthen you. And that he can satisfy you. For Jesus is the bread of life.